unrehearsed program. The views expressed are those of the guests and not necessarily those of the producer. Today's topic:
the United Nations and her tormentors in Passion for Truth award-winning program.
Welcome to another edition of Passion for Truth. The United Nations Human Rights Council has come up with something that seems to be quite positive and unique. It has come up with a 4-year process in which every government must submit an account of its human rights to the scrutiny of its peers. Will this change the behavior of the governments in North Korea, Iran, or other democratic countries who have a record of human rights abuses? We'll talk to our panelists next. Dr. Gregory Staunton, President, Genocide Watch, also professor at George Mason University, formerly affiliated with the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. George Nestuchek from the management consulting firm Nestuchek and Associates, also former staff director with the U.S. House of Representatives. Dr. Joseph Annunziata with expertise on international affairs. As a former professor, Dr. Annunziata was an advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Defense on international issues. He was also a senior staff member at the White House. Dr. Abul Hassan Ansari, a researcher on the historical perspectives of Indian events impacting on Muslims in India and abroad. And Chuck Woolery from Editorial Board, World Hanger Education Services, formerly with the World Federalist Association, whose objective is to strengthen the United Nations. Welcome you all. Starting with you, Greg, will it highlight the cause of those who have been the victims of human rights?
I think that for countries that take the process seriously, yes, it will. That, by the way, includes a lot of countries, so it's a very important process. For example, when the Obama administration began the process of preparing its report, it literally went all over the country interviewing people from all walks of life about human rights here in the country. I think it was extremely useful. And other countries have done the same. So, yes, I think it is a very good process. Now, your basic question, though, is this going to change the behavior of governments in Iran or North Korea? No, it's not, because those countries are not free countries in which, people have the freedom to express their opinions, and so the government's reports are going to be whitewashes.
What if the governments, George, polish their acts before they come to Geneva?
Well, that's sort of like putting the lipstick on a pig, as the expression goes here. I just don't see that the forum is one that really carries any kind of sanctions or any means of enforcing its findings. It all relies on goodwill and follow-up on the parts of the serial offenders. And by definition, serial offenders aren't going to be embarrassed by a public forum. If that were the case, then they'd be modifying their behavior because it was in their self-interest to do so. So I think long-term, people within their countries can affect the behavior of their government much more readily than an external body like the Human Rights Council.
Joe, how do you respond to Greg's remarks that it will not change the behaviors of the North Korea or Pakistan or Iran? Why would you omit those countries?
Well, I agree with both the comments that have been made that there's a long history of trying to get governments to change their human rights abuses. And to ask the governments themselves to come out publicly in an international forum and say, mea culpa, we are very bad, we are putting people in prison, and we're awful. It's just unrealistic to expect that to happen. I think some things may come out anyway, but I think you're going to get more revelation of internal abuses from newspapers and NGOs in particular, who work within the country, and they're freer to express what and do the research. The government, I think, is not going to, even in this country, I wouldn't expect the United States to go out and wash its dirty linen out in public.
If the UN Council that we are talking about, Dr. Ansari, launches investigations in countries which have been perpetrators of the crimes, you see tangible benefits?
Well, first of all, I think we stated that we rely on the government to come up with their dirty laundries. With this, unless you have a reinforcement, I'll give the example about India. I'm Indian, and I know what's going on over there, and I also will give some example of Israel. India has been violating human rights in Kashmir for a long, long time, and we have never questioned, and India refuses even to let Amnesty International or Human Rights Watchdog to go and talk to the people over there. So unless you have a muscle and you can reinforce it, this is not going to work. Second thing, Israel, we all know that has been having a lot of human rights violations against the Palestinians or those who are unarmed. Nothing has been done. Similarly, as long as we do not have any reinforceable laws that or sanction, as you said, sanction usually don't work, and I'm really not in favor of sanction. Second example is the Sikhs. I mean, the one Sikh has killed one Indira Gandhi, and then all the Sikh community was wiped out across the nation. Today they haven't found one criminal. Nobody ever been punished or questioned. I mean, what kind of things we are talking about? If we really want to enforce the things that, hey, if you don't comply, you don't let any Geneva Human Rights Commission or Amnesty International to go and look into those things, these things on the paper look very good, but they are not going to be helpful.
Well, what do you think, Chuck, if this 4-year process does not investigate the crimes committed, as Dr. Ansari mentions, is this then just a symbolic, becomes have only symbolic significance?
Yeah, I think so, and it's symbolism is sometimes good, but I think what George said, that the fundamental and also the no muscle, there is no means within the UN to enforce human rights. There just isn't. And it's a fundamental flaw of the United Nations that was really inherent in its construction when the idea of national sovereignty was put supreme over human rights. And so what you have is a structure that's incapable of enforcing human rights, but yet it has the mandate. And then you have countries like the United States, some in our government, who oppose the UN because it's weak and anemic, but yet refuse it to give it the power it would actually need to enforce the human rights. So until we come to an agreement that the protection of human rights should be supreme over national sovereignty, the right of any country to do anything it wants, whenever it wants, we're stuck with this problem. And, yeah.
Age-long battle, Mr. Check, between the human rights and the sovereignty of the nation as well as the human rights abuses. How are we going to put this into perspective for us?
No,
Yeah.
I'm in favor of the national rights coming first, because until you have a nation with people that elect their own representatives and look after their well-being, external interventions invite all kinds of bad things, like empires, for example, foreign domination of another state, imposing its own will on the people of a foreign nation. That's not good. In theory, the notion that somehow human rights supersede everything breaks down in the practical world of application. And I'd rather see smaller administrative units, such as nation states, as opposed to an international framework that can get really fuzzy around the edges for me. I'd rather see the nation state, although as a given for that, a representative nation state where people do speak for themselves, elect representatives for themselves, govern themselves, so that if there are any abuses at the state level, there are mechanisms within the state to address those.
I think the ability of the United Nations to act more effectively in the area of human rights violations, this has been strengthened in the last several years. It used to be called a Human Rights Commission, and when it was a commission, it had practically no power at all. But now it's called a Human Rights Council, so it's equivalent to the Security Council. and the Economic Council. So the larger nations that are on that Human Rights Council now can act with a little more authority. Secondly, they have enlarged the council and the commission so that it's not just a few people that control the agenda and the follow-on action of the hearings. And thirdly, there was a third point I was going to make about the commission, about the council. They have now worked it so that nations could possibly start accusing other nations. In the past, they've been hesitant to do that, saying, well, if I say India is not doing something right, then India is going to say Pakistan is not doing something. And so they have nullified the ability of one country to reveal something about the other country. But now I think they have a mechanism in process where they can feel free of revealing the abuses of another country.
So the bottom line is that the UN Council now has more to it. And is more effective now as
Yes.
it is?
Yes, because they have, they're not a subsidiary anymore. They are a council in their own right.
To add to that, the Human Rights Council has the power to launch investigations in situations where it believes that human rights have been violated. And the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Nabi Pillay, has the right to bring to the Council situations such as that and ask them to launch such investigations. And she's been quite aggressive in doing that. So actually it is a lot better, as you were just saying, than the old Human Rights Commission. By the way, I just wanted to take up the issue that both Chuck and George brought up. I believe there's been a shift in international law in some degree. The UN, when it was founded, was definitely founded on a nation-state sovereignty system, in which, you could basically, if you were a nation-state, do anything you wanted to your own citizens within your country, within your territory. Recently, there's been a new doctrine called the responsibility to protect that was first written about by Francis Deng some 20 years ago. He's now the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. But it was adopted at the Millennium 2005 Summit by consensus. And basically that doctrine says the first priority, the first entity that is responsible for protecting the rights of its citizens is, yes, the nation state. But if the nation state is systematically violating the rights of its own citizens, like committing genocide against them and so forth, then the international community, including the UN, has a duty to stop that kind of violation. And it's only been applied a few times. I think Libya is one of the few cases that I know of where it's actually been applied. But this is a growing, what we call growing doctrine of international law that hopefully, I think, will eventually make national sovereignty less and less important.
The new members who joined the council recently include India, Indonesia, Costa Rica, and Peru. Do you think they will play the activist role? We'll take a quick break and come right back. Stay with us. Passion for Truth. Chuck, will these new countries that have joined the Human Rights Council, do you think they will accept transparency and accountability? They do not seem to have a very good record in the past.
Yeah, I'll put my money on Costa Rica. I think they'll do quite well. The concern that I had is George seemed to imply that the influence of countries across borders is not a good thing. But yet, in today's world, our economy right now is at risk from an EU economic collapse. Our country has been at risk before from a bird flu coming out of Asia. We have, if Israel attacks Iran, or Iran attacks Israel, our country is going to be really hurting in a number of different areas, from economic to oil to security reasons. The environmental issues, the point being that our country is influenced by so many decisions in so many countries, everywhere across the board. There's not an area in which we're not influenced. And to think that our sovereignty protects us against those threats is absolutely just completely unbased. That if you look back at the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, well, one thing that makes our country so great is our Bill of Rights, that it is enforceable. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created to prevent the conflict and the problems that are associated with injustice and poverty and disease and all that. And it was created for that purpose. But it's just a piece of paper.
Okay, Dr. Ansari, countries like Cuba, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, they continue to oppose this approach of to intervene in other countries' affairs.
Well, they are going to oppose it. I mean, regardless of what you do. I mean, frankly, they are unwilling to expose their own human rights violations that have been going on. I can give the example. For example, in India, untouchables have been their human rights have been violated since over 5,000 years of BC. I mean, this is going on even today. Muslims, Christians, and recently you mentioned about the state level. I mean, Modi, he killed about 6,000 Muslims. I mean, even he created the whole thing. Now the things are coming out that he is guilty. He's the one who engineered the whole process. So are we going to go back just like Israelis did for the Nazi hunters? Or should we say, okay, let us start with a new slate? A crime is a crime, must never go unpunished regardless who commits it, India, Pakistan, Iran, or any Western countries. Unless we have one standard and reinforceable laws, to me it looked like this council is like an old wine with a new label. It's not going to produce any result. If they have produced any result, show it to me and I will believe in it.
Old wine with new label? How do you respond to his remarks?
Well, as I said, I do think that things are changing. The concept of individual state sovereignty is ceding now to understanding that there are international laws, that there are international standards of behavior that even the states must comply with. We have the International Criminal Court, and you can take people from a state and generals and leaders who now can be tried by international standards. Also, there is a greater emphasis on the preamble to the United Nations Charter, which starts, "We the people." So the Charter is not, the UN is not established by nations. It was established by the people of the world. And that was the language of Eleanor Roosevelt, who wrote that in there. So there is a greater emphasis now on responsibility to intervene and protect. So I think it's evolving. It may take 10 or 20 years because that old concept of sovereignty, national sovereignty, which started with Napoleon back in the late 18th century, is beginning to erode.
Well, George, what will this process do for countries like Sri Lanka, where people and government are in constant battle with each other, and some of Sri Lanka's citizens are frustrated with their government, and they have asked for an independent investigation of alleged atrocities and war crimes against the Tamil Tigers. But the government in Sri Lanka is equally frustrated with its citizens, revolts, frustration, and violence. What will the council do in such circumstances?
I hope they do nothing. That clearly, the political situation within Sri Lanka is evolving. If the government recognizes that there are two extreme points of view that are battling within the country, and we're talking about the two extremes within Sri Lanka, who's to step in at that point and split any differences? clearly there's an evolving evolutionary process, and that in and of itself to me speaks for the fact that you can't just willy-nilly be imposing external points of views and values wherever you choose to. You know, today Sri Lanka, tomorrow Cuba. When do we get around to Russia? Russia, was, as the Soviet Union, was one of the founders of the We the People Declaration, and yet they were one of the worst abusers for decades, and no one lifted a finger to even criticize them. So, you know, in theory, these are all good, and they do establish a standard. I accept that, and it's a good standard, and it's one that we can strive to push evolving nations towards. But to externally send in troops or peacekeepers or what have you, whenever someone, as a result of debate, chooses that they're not quite up to the standard yet, is, I think, hazardous worldwide. So, you know, I just see limitations there. The fact that you've got Cuba on the council opposing to external interventions when they've been one of the worst abusers in that respect for decades again, sending in even military interventions, undermining legitimate states. Here's Cuba intervening externally around the whole region for 50 years.
George, we agree on that. Okay. We agree on that. No,
well,
they should be held accountable. But you can't hold them accountable when you shouldn't.
You shouldn't.
Let them do what they want to do. That's the right of national sovereignty. That's the system we have now.
You give up national sovereignty. Legitimate states who are not violators would have to, of necessity, give up their own sovereignty in order to reach a Cuba. Outrageous for me.
George,
can't accept those kinds
is a concept we have in our head, and we have it on paper in words. It doesn't exist in the real world. In the real world, there is no sovereignty. Sovereignty, if you wanted to define it, it's actually we each as individuals have a bit of sovereignty. It's the willingness to cooperate with other entities. And we give a little bit to our wife, we give a little bit to our state government, we give a little bit to our national government. But most of the threats we face today are coming from the world, from around the world. And we have no power to deal with it. The only way we can have power to deal with it is give a little bit of that sovereignty to an international...
I don't think we should be dealing with it.
If we have power to deal with these countries, Greg, how will this process control the pro-government media, which can distort the reality for everybody? Well, there are spin masters everywhere.
First of all, let me address this concept of sovereignty, because let's take a look at the word. The word sovereignty is a concept that came from the monarchist era. It's based on kingship. Our founding fathers in the United States rejected it. They said sovereignty belongs with the people. If you try to get away from that, then you are getting away from the bases on which democracies are based, and in fact on which the UN is based. That's why you were right to point out this business about the peoples of the world. So I think that it's wrong to think that somehow it's illegal for international institutions to intervene when somebody like Omar al-Bashir is committing genocide in Sudan, or when Saddam Hussein is committing genocide in Iraq. I think that is perfectly legal. I think it is exactly what the Responsibility to Protect doctrine is about. And I think it was right for us to help bring down Gaddafi. So, sorry, but I just don't agree with you, George, that sovereignty should be some kind of absolute principle. Sovereignty has been the cloak under which hundreds of millions of people have died at the hands of their own governments over the last 2 centuries. And I'm sorry, but I think it's time that we stop that.
I think every time that you have an international agreement, whether it's a treaty, a peace treaty, or an economic treaty, or whatever, there is a relinquishment of sovereignty. Everybody has to give a little bit to say, okay, for the good of the whole, whether it's the European Economic Union or the United States. I mean, each of our 50 states had to give up sovereignty in order to form the Union of the United States of America. And some of them are still fighting that. They still believe in states' rights.
Can we measure progress in incremental doses, Dr. Musari? Countries like India and Pakistan have so many prisoners, and it would be momentous if as a result of this Human Rights Council with a 4-year process, they would release the political prisoners who were incarcerated for wrong reasons.
Well, let me tell you about in India. Let me speak about India then about Pakistan. India had a rule that TADA, that we so much publicized. Then they came with the POTA, which is more draconian law that they can put you in jail for 15, 20 years without even charging you. Literally, there are hundreds and thousands of people who are under quota. You cannot challenge them, and they have been in jail for a long time. Same thing is happening in Pakistan. In our country here in the United States, has the largest numbers of people in the prison. Do we have so many criminals that we have the largest prisoner population? We need to look into those things. And second thing is that he mentioned about the International Criminal Code. We didn't sign it. We are not the signatory of the International Criminal Code. So if we had signed it, I can tell you one thing. A lot of our leaders will be facing their investigation by the International Criminal Court. So till we have one standard, one rule that is enforceable and reinforceable. We have put the sanction against Iran. We have put the sanction about Cuba. I mean, they are not, I mean, they are violating human rights or whatever they are doing it. We have done it, so why can't we do it about other countries who are not abiding by these rules? And you think India, which has committed, or Pakistan that has committed crime against humanity, you think they are going to come and tell you, hey, we have done this much? What you're going to do? I mean, the most you can do is reinforce the sanction, and sanctions have never worked.
We'll be right back with our closing comments. Stay with us, Passion for Truth. United Nations Council should be helping, do you think should be helping some resurgent conflicts in the bud before they can spill off more carnage? Is that the job of the Human Rights Council? Very briefly, please, we don't have much time left, starting with you, Greg.
Yes, I think that the UN can have an incremental effect, but I do believe, and here's where I do actually agree with George, that these changes really have to be done internally as much as possible.
George?
I just don't see that external interventions are going to be very helpful in the future any more than they have been in the past. There have been individual successes, but they're the exception, not the rule.
Joe?
Yeah, I don't think we should think of external interventions as being military interventions all the time. But sometimes these interventions are pressure, political pressure, world pressure that is put on the government to change its policy with regard to the internal democratic processes. I mean, we have this Arab Spring now. You know, you have Egypt and Tunisia and Libya, and it's going all across the Middle East, and it's going into a lot of dictatorial, authoritarian regimes who are now beginning to feel we better change our act because the people themselves are going to rise up against us. And I think that's the kind of pressure that will be effective.
Well, that's right. The people have to rebel, but look at the Libya or, Iraq. We invaded them. One question is that if China and Russia is doing the same thing, are we willing to invade those countries? No. Because you know what could happen. So till we have one rule that should be reinforceable internationally, these things are not going to do any good.
Chuck, you have the last word.
Yeah. Well, interventions can be good and they can be bad. We have to have the international standards, and they have to be enforceable consistently in order for the world to all buy into it. If we treat one country differently than another country, we're not going to have peace, and we don't have time to fight.
And that's all the time we have. We'll bring you another edition of Passion for Truth next Saturday.
Thanks.
Very good.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you all.
If you have any question, comment, or suggestion on this program, please send us an email at mschawla@hotmail.com or write to us at 1011 South Meadow Lane, McLean, Virginia, 22101.